Hi, my name is Summer Gomez, and we're going to talk about understanding the LGBTQ plus community. Now, first, I want to introduce the idea of a spectrum, because sexual orientation and gender identity fall on spectrums. Now, one example of a spectrum is color. So you've got red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, and it can all be subdivided down into its separate parts. For example, between blue and green, you've got turquoise, etc. And sexual orientation and gender identity and expression are similar in that they fall on spectrums. Now, this is the diagram of sex and gender, or the diagram of SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And what this diagram does is it breaks down the different aspects of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And we're going to go through each line one at a time so that we can better understand it. On the top line, we have sex assigned at birth. That's based on anatomy, which is based on chromosomes and hormones. And on the one side, we have boy, and on the other side, we have girl. So you get what I'm talking about, but that's kind of a different way to put it, sex assigned at birth. The reason we put it like that is because your mother gave birth to you. The doctor looked at your anatomy and said, congratulations, it's a girl, or congratulations, it's a boy. But the doctor never asked you how you identify. So we say it was assigned to you at birth by the doctor based on your anatomy. Now, it's a spectrum. On the one side, there's boy. On the other side, there's girl. In the middle space, you'll see that term intersex. Some people are born with the anatomy and or the chromosomes and or the hormones of both a boy and a girl. If you're familiar with the previous term hermaphrodite, that's what we're talking about here, but we don't use that term anymore. That's an outdated term. So we use the term intersex. Now, intersex variations make up about 1% to 2% of the population, and there's over 42 different types of intersex variations. Now, the next aspect of this diagram is gender identity, and that's your psychological sense of yourself. Are you a man or are you a woman? Do you feel like a man or do you feel like a woman? And again, it's a spectrum. So there in the middle space, you'll see the term two-spirit. Two-spirit refers to somebody within the Native American community who identifies as LGBT, and it refers to the fact that they have the spirit of both a man and a woman together in one body. You'll also see the term third gender. Some people don't identify as a man nor a woman. They identify as a third gender. And some people identify as non-binary. That word binary meaning this or that. So non-binary meaning beyond that binary. Now, gender identity is interesting because it develops naturally. Kids learn to walk around the age of 1. They learn to talk around the age of 2. Gender identity develops naturally between the ages of 3 and 6. So if you think back to any kids that you've watched grow up, you'll notice that when they are 1 or 2, they don't know or care what their gender is. They don't know or care what the gender of anybody else is. They just are. But between those ages of 3 to 6, that's when they start to identify, I am a girl, or I am a boy, you are a girl, or you are a boy, you are a man, or you are a woman. And that's because it's right during that period of time from 3 to 6 when their gender identity is starting to develop. Now, the relationship between these first two lines, between sex assigned at birth and gender identity, that's where we get the transgender experience. So if somebody's sex assigned at birth was boy and they identify as a woman, they are a transgender woman. If somebody's sex assigned at birth was girl and they identify as a man, then they are a transgender man. Now, there's also a word for those people who are not transgender, and that word is cisgender, C-I-S, cisgender. And it comes from the Latin cis, meaning same side. So if your sex assigned at birth is on the same side as your gender identity, you are cisgender. So using myself as an example, my sex assigned at birth was girl. I identify as a woman. I am a cisgender woman. Now, the next aspect of this diagram is gender expression, and that's how we communicate gender. So there's a picture of a hat because one of the ways that we communicate gender is by the clothing that we wear. On the one side, there's masculine. I think of like a suit and tie as being very masculine. On the other side, there's feminine. I think of like a dress or a skirt as being very feminine. And in that middle space, you'll see the term androgynous. I think of like jeans and a t-shirt as being androgynous. Anybody can wear it. Now, gender expression is interesting because it is culturally bound. So I mentioned that a skirt seems very feminine. That's from my cultural lens. If we were to go to another culture, say for example, Scotland, we would likely see men wearing kilts. And from the Scottish perspective, a kilt is seen as very masculine. The warriors wore them. So you can see there how culture shapes gender expression and how we perceive gender expression. Even the colors pink and blue that we think of as being for girls and boys, even those have changed over time and through cultures. Several hundred years ago, pink was seen as light red, which was seen as a very masculine color. It was associated with things like blood and war, and boys were oftentimes put in pink to express their masculinity. Blue, on the other hand, was seen as a very feminine color. There are paintings of the Virgin Mary wearing blue, and so girls were oftentimes put in blue dresses to express their femininity. Now, the next aspect of this diagram is sexual orientation, and that's who you are physically and romantically attracted to. On the one side, there's gay or lesbian, attracted to somebody of the same gender. On the other side, there's straight or heterosexual, attracted to somebody of the opposite gender. And again, it's a spectrum. So there in that middle space, you'll see the term bisexual, the prefix bi meaning two, like bicycle. So somebody who identifies as bisexual is saying that they're potentially attracted to their own gender and potentially attracted to another gender. You'll also come across the term pansexual. And that prefix pan is like panorama. It encompasses everything. So somebody who identifies as pansexual is saying that they're potentially attracted to men and potentially attracted to women and potentially attracted to non-binary people and potentially attracted to transgender people. And they tend to say that it's the person's heart or soul or spirit that they're attracted to. In that middle space, you'll also see the term asexual. And in this case, that prefix a means nothing. So some people have no particular sexual attraction. They're not particularly attracted to men and they're not particularly attracted to women. And it doesn't mean that something's wrong with them. Being asexual is a perfectly valid sexual orientation that's considered a part of the LGBTQ+ spectrum. Now, sexual orientation is interesting because it also develops naturally. While gender identity develops between the ages of 3 and 6, sexual orientation has a much broader range of development. It develops between the ages of 5 and 25. So if you think back to your first crush, I would bet that it's probably between those ages of 5 and 25 because first crushes are an indication of the development of sexual orientation. Now, the last aspect of this diagram is sexual or dating behavior. And on the one side, there's relationships with women, and on the other side, there's relationships with men. And the reason I added this line in was to further emphasize how different each aspect of this diagram is. And to remind us that we don't want to make any assumptions about any aspect of this diagram based on any other aspect of the diagram. They don't necessarily correspond to each other. So Just like gender identity doesn't necessarily match gender expression. For example, I could put on a suit and tie and I would still be a woman. By the same token, sexual or dating behavior doesn't necessarily have to correspond with sexual orientation. For example, I have a friend who's a woman and she's married to a man. So if you were to make an assumption about her sexual orientation, you would likely assume that she identifies as heterosexual. But if you were to actually get to know her and have a conversation with her about it, she would share that she identifies as pansexual. So we don't want to make any assumption based on any aspect of this diagram based on any other aspect of the diagram. Now, what's most important is self-definition. People are who they say they are, and we want to honor that self-definition. So this slide shows a classroom, and there's a girls' line and a boys' line. And standing next to the teacher in the front is a little child wearing blue and pink stripes. And they're saying, "Sorry, teacher, but where do the kids whose most salient identity isn't gender and instead self-identify as awesome line up?" So this little kid is awesome, and we want to honor that. We want to respect that. People are who they say they are. So how do we respect that? One way that we can respect that is by using the correct name. Now, by correct, I mean the name that somebody wants to go by. Now, some transgender and non-binary people in particular, when they come out as transgender or non-binary, they will take on a new name. And at that point, their previous name is said to be dead. That's their dead name. And if we use their dead name, it's very offensive. It implies that what's most important isn't their identity, but is rather our feelings about it. And it damages a relationship. Relationships are so important. And if we damage that relationship by dead naming somebody, we lose opportunities to get to know people. Another way that we can honor self-definition is by using the correct pronouns. Now, pronouns are those little parts of speech that tell us who we're talking about. So she, her, hers, he, him, his. If we're talking about a plural group, say a group of 100 people, we would say they, them, their. So if that group of 100 people went to the market, we would say they went to the market, I went with them, the bags are theirs. But one benefit of they, them, and their is that it is gender neutral. So some people will prefer to use the gender neutral they, them, and their as their singular pronoun. So for example, my friend Chris, who's non-binary, uses they, them, and their pronouns. And I would say, they went to the market, I went with them, the bags are theirs. There's also a category of pronouns known as neopronouns. And one example of neopronouns is z, zir, zirs. You would say Z went to the market, I went with zir, the bags are zirs. There's a lot of these neopronouns, and it's less important to memorize the neopronouns than it is to know that they exist. And it is important to know how to use they, them, and their pronouns correctly. If you don't know somebody's pronouns, you can do a couple of things. You can use they pronouns until you figure out what pronouns they go by. You can refer to them by their name, or you can pull them aside privately and ask them, hey, what are your pronouns? Another thing you can do is you can introduce yourself with your name and your pronouns, and they'll oftentimes reciprocate with their name and their pronouns. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I hope it was informative.